Okay. Good morning, everyone. I must say, so much of what you said has to do with what I'm going to talk about today. My part today is to talk about examples of prayer in the Andre Luiz series, the Spiritist books that were psychographed by Francisco Candido Xavier. And Andre Luiz was a doctor on earth during his last incarnation. He traveled in the spirit world, and he was a student and an observer, and then later transmitted his experiences via the extraordinary psychographic mediumship of Chico Xavier. And so in this series, we're given a lot more than just a glimpse into the workings of prayer in the spirit world and in the incarnate world, and far more than secondhand stories relating the bare bones of events that have happened in the past. In fact, we're given a wide open window on the uses of prayer, the effects of prayer, showing us that prayer is both real and powerful. Okay? And as we will see, let's see, make sure I get this right. Okay. Prayer it gives strength to those who pray, protects us from evil influences, helps us to prepare for difficult tasks, and creates a powerful link from the lowest to the highest spirits beyond, leading us ever closer to God. So, now preparing for this speech, I asked myself, why is it important to talk about the value of prayer? And why is an understanding of the power of prayer necessary in this modern world of ours? And by way of answering, let me relate to you a story that I came across in the news just a few months ago. This was regarding Pope Francis, who was the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Mahmoud Abbas, and Shimon Peres. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian state, and Shimon Peres, a former prime minister of Israel. They all got together at the Vatican at the invitation of the Pope in June, in the summer, to discuss ways of bringing about peace in the Middle East. And at the end of their meeting, they prayed together for peace. And this was the point, actually, he called them to come together to pray and do so very publicly for peace in the Middle East. And at the end of the meeting, they did so. But shortly afterwards, the fighting between Hamas and Israel broke out even stronger, even more violent. And this led some critics to say that the effort to pray had been not only ineffective, but in fact utterly useless. They concluded, after all, they said, the exact opposite of the intended result had taken place. So I submit that this is exactly where a study of the Andre Luiz series would provide some much needed insight into the effects and seeming non-effects of prayer. So here in the material world, we find it difficult to see the effects of prayer. We have intuitions, certainly. We encounter circumstantial evidence, but there's an impenetrable wall between us and the spirit world. However, through the mediumship of Chico Xavier, we're allowed to penetrate through that wall. For instance, almost at the very beginning of the series in the book No Solar, we witnessed the power of prayer when Andre, who we later learn has been the frequent though unwitting recipient of prayer from his mother, who was a much higher spirit, is finally inspired to pray after having spent several years languishing in the umbral, which is the lower zone, as we know it in English. This is a place of misery inhabited by spirits who have lived lives of selfishness, wasted opportunities. But when Andre finds his way to prayer, a wondrous change occurs. I can read to you an excerpt from the book to give an idea. So he says, "For hours I prayed like a helpless child. Had God abandoned me? Wasn't I also a child of God? Why wouldn't God, who watched over the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, forgive me? I soon came to see that before one can fully appreciate the sweetness of hope, one must often know regret, rejection, humiliation." And isn't this true? Isn't this the way that we learn at our present level of evolution? So he goes on to say, "The moment I recognized that reality, the thick fog that had surrounded me since my arrival broke up and cleared away." So here we see that it's not only prayer but Andre's persistence in praying, that, coupled with a humble acceptance of his reality, some humility, that establishes this connection with God. So he sees an old man after the fog is cleared away, Clarence, who says, "Courage, my child, God hasn't deserted you." And later on he assures Andre that no prayer goes unanswered. This is important. So we're given our first of many examples showing the way that prayer links us to higher spiritual realms. Andre's mother, again, who is far above her son in her own spiritual evolution, helps him to see beyond his suffering, to the possibility of a better existence in the spirit world. Okay? So then later, after his rescue, he goes to a great hall. He witnesses the power of collective prayer. In a gathering of spirits in the city of Nosalar, Andre sees the image of a beautiful temple projected onto a gigantic screen. And within the temple, he sees an old man praying who has a halo of light around him. And with him are 72 individuals also praying with great concentration. And they begin singing. And as the last notes of the hymn died away, the shape of a wonderful heart, light blue in color, emitting delicate rays of gold, appeared above in the distance. Soft music arose, it seemed, from very distant spheres. And suddenly, as if from nowhere, beautiful blue flowers began to shower down on us. The petals touching our foreheads, hovered an instant and then vanished. And suddenly I felt the contact of a petal. A surge of energy went through me as if my heart had been magically touched by a powerful balm. So here we see the power of collective prayer to receive blessings from a higher spiritual sphere. Andre, remember, was in the umbral just a short time ago, nearly prostrate, had no energy, nothing. He had to be carried out of the umbral and brought to the city. And now here he is receiving energies and feeling this great surge of power within him from prayer. So we're shown that this makes a connection. In fact, when we pray, we're connected to higher spirits who are themselves connected to higher spirits in a seemingly endless chain that leads to God. So, as asserted by the spirits, in answer to question 659, what is the true essence of prayer? We are told that to pray is to think of and to draw closer to God. It's an act of worship. Okay, so this great chain of being is explained very well in a striking passage from Between Heaven and Earth, in which Clarence explains the meaning behind the biblical story of Jacob's ladder. So here he says, "From brightest light to complete darkness, the Creator's breath flows in and out through countless beings of all tones of instinct, intelligence, reason, humanity, and angelhood." I like this kind of ladder that he describes here, the words that he uses. So, angelhood is above all. The pathway of spiritual ascent is that wondrous ladder in Jacob's vision, which went from the earth to be lost in the heavens. So this gives us, again, a vivid picture to represent the myriad levels of spiritual development. Now, given this spiritual diversity of evolutionary levels, we might ask, we might wonder, what effect does the level of an individual's spiritual development have on their reception of messages from higher spiritual realms? So we get an answer on this. Chapter 24 of the book, The Messengers, talks about this. We're given the idea, the description of the effects of prayer given by someone named Ismailia, who is a highly evolved spirit. She's the loving wife of Alfredo, who runs an outpost for ignorant and suffering spirits in a particularly dark area of the lower zone, which is where spirits who have committed serious transgressions in their last earthly lives may end up staying for a period of time until they're ready to be rescued through the enlightened intercession of higher spirits. And so here we have some of the worst cases to be found in this outpost. In fact, when Andre sees them, he is reminded of mummies. They are so absolutely lifeless, no sign of life in them, and so thoroughly have they been immobilized by their own inner suffering. You know, they are reliving the terrible things that they have done in their last life. And so, in an effort to assist these unfortunate spirits, Ismailia prays for help from the divine. And she says, "Magnanimous King, have pity on your suffering subjects. Compassionate Creator, lift up your fallen creatures. Righteous Father, forgive your unfortunate children. And then something wonderful happens. Light appears to radiate from her body like diamonds. Andre looks around and he sees that many of the workers around her are also emitting what he describes as a luminous manifestation, but to a lesser degree, and with varying colors of blue, green, and lilac. And even Andre and his fellow student Vicente emit what he calls a weak luminosity. So then she continues to pray, and Andre looks up and he sees a large quantity of whitish flakes falling down. Many different sizes falling on those who were praying, but not on those who were sleeping. And this is significant. They were not praying. Their minds were not conscious of what was happening. So the flakes fell upon those who were conscious. And after seeming to melt into their skin, they produced great luminous bubbles. Now, these fell from their foreheads and from their chests. Again, the strongest coming from Ismailia. And then the bubbles went to the sleeping patients. So eventually they do receive some help. And seeing this, Andre concludes, he says, in that instant of contact with the higher plane, everyone revealed their own worth in the work they could offer. And his guide, Aniceto, adds to this. He says to Andre that each spirit has a different capacity for receiving them, the flakes, and this capacity is the result of the individual's efforts at striving toward the higher plane. So the effort that you make has an effect on what you're able to receive. So here we're given a direct correlation, I'd say, between our efforts and our abilities. I'm reminded of the biblical quotation, to those who have, more will be given. Here we have the true meaning of that phrase. Ismailia is capable of receiving more because of her sustained effort to reach the higher planes. The others who have not maintained that same sustained effort are capable of less. And the so-called mummies, who have made no effort at all, are not capable of any manifestation whatsoever. But then the bubbles come from those more enlightened spirits and fall on those unfortunate spirits as if guided by an intelligent will, and they miraculously now they show signs of life. So help is given to them. So in this example, we're shown individuals of various evolutionary levels, that they're links in a chain stretching from the divine all the way to the least evolved of creation. And Ismailia receives energies from a spiritual plane that is more evolved than herself, but through her prayer, she is able to link to that. And then she passes on energies to the less evolved of the outposts, and they pass on to the patients. So Aniceto explains, the Lord does not come in person to dry the tears of the needy who weep as the result of having forgotten the divine laws. Instead, he assists people of goodwill through good people who have been schooled in the divine house of goodness. So, in other words, God helps us by way of these links, and help is delegated according to the level of evolution displayed by those in need. So once again, in the book Heaven and Earth, we're given a wonderfully clear image of the mechanism for this transfer of power from on high, when Minister Clarence says, just as electricity has transformers for the appropriate use of its power, every realm of the universe has transformers of blessing, help, and enlightenment. So what this clear image tells us is that the appropriate level of energy is transmitted to the recipient by the instrument that is best able to deliver it. And too great a light is blinding, and too little doesn't offer sufficient illumination. So again, our ability to receive the light of the divine is determined by our own efforts. And it's just a small step to take from the words of Leon Denis, who is the consolidator of Spiritism. He said, we are what we think, if we think with force and persistence and will. To go from here to the words of Clarence, in Between Heaven and Earth, he says, our desires are congealed mental energies that materialize by our actions and which constitute the true arena in which we live our lives. The fruits speak for the trees that produce them. The shape of our thoughts gives shape to our destiny. So again, to pray is to think and draw closer to God, as it was saying in the Spirit's book. So we can conclude that prayer is a specialized form of thought that makes use of this great chain leading to God. And a chain that basically transforms the light of God into the appropriate level of intensity for each recipient. And that the level of intensity is determined by the degree of effort put forth by that individual to reach the higher planes. So we may ask, though, what of those who use prayer for evil purposes? In fact, this is a question that is asked of Clarencio, their guide. And he cautions them. He says, he cautions against referring to such activity as prayer. He's saying instead that it should be called an invocation. And he explains that whenever anyone nourishes the desire to commit a wrong, he or she is invoking powers of a low order and is mobilizing resources which become instruments for low idealizations. Okay. So there are, of course, many examples of this in the literature. One such is the story of Odila, the first wife of Omaro. This is in Between Heaven and Earth. She dies young. So she's the wife, she dies young. Amaro, her husband, remarries. And his second wife, Zulmira, becomes jealous of her husband's two children by his first marriage, Evelina and Giulio. But especially the love he showers on the boy, Giulio. She eventually develops a desire to see him die. And on an outing to the beach with the family, she gets her wish. Evelina goes out on a boat with her father, and Zulmira is left to watch the boy on the beach. Giulio goes out into the ocean swimming, and Zulmira let him go too far. A wave catches him, forces him under. He manages to surface once, crying for help, and at this moment, she could have helped. Zulmira could have called to Amaro for rescue, but she hesitates. And then Giulio is caught by another wave, and he drowns. In the meantime, Odila, who is a spirit, observing, she is the first discarnate wife of Amaro. She reads Zulmira's thoughts and begins to torment her. And she engages in obsession. And the effects on Zulmira, devastating, absolutely devastating. Odila's daughter, Evelina, in the meantime, prays to her mother for aid, unaware that it is her mother who is the cause of the trouble. So her prayers are diverted away. This is a case of diverted prayer. Diverted towards spirits who are able to respond, because Odila is not able. She is consumed by her anger and her jealousy, her rage. So it has to go somewhere else in order to be answered. Remember, all prayers, every prayer is answered. So eventually this prayer reaches a highly evolved spirit by the name of Clara, who comes to her aid and intercedes. Clara, who has achieved what Clarence, their spirit guide, describes as the complete equilibrium of the force centers, prays. And we're told that, she stretched out her arms in prayer. The room gradually filled with light that radiated out toward Clara. She was like a star, and a large aura of splendor, like etherealized luminescent gold, surrounded her light, sublime form. So the light that emanates from her is described as waves of varying tonalities, shades of gold and opal to bright pink, from bright pink to sky blue, from sky blue to light green, and from light green to soft violet, and then into hues that Andre confesses are beyond his ability to describe. So, such is the power of these emanations that Odila is overwhelmed and comes to the realization that she's doing wrong. So this is yet another power of prayer that's revealed, that of restoring balance. So Clara is able to break through and show Odila that her motivations to do harm to Zulmira do not come from love. And she tells her there is no point of contact between love and revenge, and shows her that through prayer that is infused with true love, she can reach out to her son, her daughter, her husband, and especially to Zulmira, giving them the support that they need to aid them in their efforts to evolve spiritually. So we see here that it isn't only the restoral of balance that is achieved in Odila, but also the potential for a restoral of balance in her family. And not only within this family circle do we see the benefits, but beyond. To illustrate this point, to see the full effect of her prayer, of this conversion, it would be beneficial to our understanding to fill you in on the backstory of these individuals. This is a term I got from reading a book about screenwriting, in which the author makes the assertion that a screenwriter should always be aware of what happened before the beginning of a screenplay, so as to be able to understand the motivations of the characters. Okay? So for those of you who are familiar with the books of Andre Louis, you know there is always a backstory. And the backstory here, of course, involves past lives and reincarnation. So for Amaro, Zulmira, and Giulio, the origin of their involvement with one another goes back to the time in 1869, during the war with Paraguay, between Brazil and Paraguay. And there are three soldiers, Estevez, Armando, and Giulio. They become involved with a young woman named Nina, who in the town of Asuncion. Estevez meets her first. He fell in love. He was secretly married to her because Brazilian soldiers at that time were not allowed to marry during a time of active war duty. So he did it secretly. Then he told his best friends in the army, Armando and Giulio, about his great love. And he takes them to meet her. Unfortunately, both of them were attracted to her as well. So Giulio made advances towards her, and she succumbed to his advances. Estevez later discovered the two of them in each other's arms, and after briefly considering, he thought about suicide. He decided to get himself stationed elsewhere, and he ended up in a town called Pirazu, where he took to drinking and gambling, and he met another woman named Lola, who was a dancer and a singer. She was romantically involved with somebody named Leonardo Perez, but she was not happy with him, so she easily gave in to her attraction to Estevez. And Leonardo found out about the affair, and then he pretended to befriend Estevez and took him to dinner and poisoned him, put poison in his wine, and Estevez died. Meanwhile, Giulio's romance with Nina was very short-lived as well. She quickly became tired of him and took up with Armando. So Giulio discovered her unfaithfulness. He tried to kill himself with poison, but did not succeed. He was saved by the soldiers in his barracks. And however, he severely damaged his throat. And that physical suffering, along with his psychological suffering, proved to be too much for him. And he tried to commit suicide again, this time successfully by jumping off a bridge and drowning himself. So Armando hears about this, and then he is overcome with guilt, and he leaves Nina. And he goes back to the army. He finished his military service and went back home to marry someone else. He had a fiancée back home all along. So this is the way of soldiers, I guess. Not all soldiers, I'm sure. But years later, so he married someone else. Years later, on a rainy night, coming home from the theater with his wife, his carriage ran over a drunken woman in the street. And he sent his wife home and took care of the woman. He took her to a hospital, tried to help to save her. And there he realized that she was none other than the woman he'd left behind, Nina. And before she died, she told him of the terrible descent her life had taken after he left. She lived a life of shame. She was abandoned by her friends and her family. And in desperation, finally, she had made her way to Rio in search of Armando. And then she died, cursing the world and everything in it. So a very sad story, sordid and sad. Now we go forward to the 20th century, early 20th century in Rio de Janeiro. Armando is reincarnated as Amaro, Nina as Zulmira, Estevez as Mario Silva, and Giulio reincarnated as the son of Amaro and Odila. And he's the one who died drowning in the ocean. So Giulio has a bad time. Before Zulmira met Amaro, she had been romantically involved with Mario Silva, but then left him to become Amaro's second wife. So in the second reincarnation, she leaves him. Remember, Mario is Estevez, so she leaves him for a second time in the next life. Lola was reincarnated as Antonina, who expiated her guilt from being unfaithful to Leonardo in the past life by, in this life, being abandoned by her husband in her incarnation as Antonina. Okay, so now she must bear the trial of having to raise her 3 children without the help of a husband. And then later she meets Mario Silva, who is attracted to her. He does not understand. He seems to feel he knows her from somewhere. He feels this attraction. We know, we have the backstory, so we know the source of this attraction. Okay, so he meets her, he's attracted to her. He is spiritually touched by her gospel in the home. She conducts the gospel in the home with her 3 children. He encounters this lesson of forgiveness. And we know this is a lesson he needs to hear. But he discovers shortly afterwards that he cannot forgive Amaro and Zulmira. He has later summoned to help them. He's a health worker. So in the meantime, Odila must be convinced to let go of her obsession against Zulmira after the death of Giulio. So after Clara's intervention, she's converted from an obsessor to a missionary. And she helps Zulmira to prepare to become a mother. She gives birth to the exact same spirit, Giulio, who is unfortunately destined to die only a few months later. He succumbs to diphtheria caused by an epidemic of flu, which was sweeping through Rio at the time. So Mario Silva, who is a health worker, is called to their home to try to save the child. And he sees who they are. He did not know until he got to the door that it was Amaro and Zulmira. So he gets to the door, he's repulsed by his hatred for them. And he wishes for the death of the child. Poor Giulio, everybody seems to want Giulio to die. But with prayerful intervention from Odila and other spirits, he overcomes this and eventually does try to help. Although the boy dies, as he is destined to do, his second birth, which could not have happened without the rebalancing of Odila through prayer, is what serves as a catalyst to finally break down Mario's attachment to hatred. So we see this effect, this benefit from this prayer. And later, Mario Silva goes back to visit Antonina, no longer held back by feelings of shame and guilt. He had held back for a time from visiting her. Though he's attracted to her, he felt ashamed of himself because he could not overcome his anger and his hatred towards Zulmira and Amaro. So now he's able to come back to her. And he and Antonina marry, and they have a son, who is the reincarnation of none other than Leonardo Perez, who is the one in the past life who poisoned and killed him. So now they have the process of healing between him and Mario, and this process begins. So Zulmira gives birth a second time now, getting back to Zulmira, to the same spirit of Giulio. So Giulio was first born to Odila, born twice to Zulmira, and the third time is the charm, as they say. This time he will live a full life after having expiated for his attempted suicide and his second attempt, his successful attempt at suicide, if we can call suicide a success, with his 2 early deaths. So that he had to expiate. He had to die twice for having attempted to kill himself twice. This is karma that had to be worked out. Now, all of this would not have been possible without the intervention of prayer by Clara, changing the heart of Odila. Now, getting back to Odila, I think we may correctly say that before her conversion to Clara, the desires of Odila to do harm to Zulmira, again, were not prayers, but invocations, supported by low spirits who encouraged her to act on her anger and her hatred. And in the Messengers, we learn that invocations spring from the same motivations on the material plane of earth as in the spiritual plane. And Alfredo, a temporary guide for Andre, during his sojourn in the spirit world, is asked to give an explanation for the reason some spirits are bent upon evil enterprises. And he says, "Ah, my friend, we could ask the same questions about earth. The criminals who create victims of war, the exploiters of the public welfare, the stingy misers, those thirsty for unjustified dominance, they torment themselves like veritable lunatics, piling up wealth to their ruin. They enter into perennial conflict with the divine spirit of the law. They resist the Lord's corrections until one day they decide to take another course. Yeah. But we may ask, until those who engage in this pursuit of revenge do decide to take another course, what defense may be employed to protect the intended victims? In many cases, the sufferings these spirits inflict is allowed by God for a time as a corrective measure for the individual. However, prayer can be employed to mitigate this suffering and even to alleviate it. Prayer is in fact very effective in protecting against the influence of spirits bent upon inflicting suffering, as well as against spirits who are simply ignorant and undisciplined. The effectiveness of prayer as a defense is clearly shown in chapter 37 of the Messengers, in a chapter called The Home Sanctuary. Aniceto, as their guide for Andre and Vicente, takes them to see firsthand the power of prayer in protecting the home. And after having witnessed a home prayer meeting, such as we talked about already, a mother and her children had a home prayer meeting, Andre notices that a storm is brewing outside, a bad storm, and he sees what he perceives as bad spirits approaching this dwelling. And he writes, "I noticed that dark shapes, some of them monstrous, were crawling along the street. I was appalled to see that several were heading in our direction. However, after a few steps, they withdrew, frightened." Aniceto tells them, "You don't have to be afraid. Look how they start to head this way and then run away, frightened and disconcerted." And he goes on to explain, he says, "Every time someone prays in a home, there is a marked improvement in its ambience. Each prayer from the heart is an electromagnetic emission of comparative power. For this very reason, the gospel home worship service is not just a study for inner illumination, but also an advanced means of outward defense because of the spiritual light surrounding it. Those who pray bear an impenetrable armor. The home that cultivates prayer becomes a fortress." And then we see another example of this protective use of prayer in Missionaries of the Light, chapter 6, entitled Prayer. Here we follow the journey of a young man who has just emerged from a spiritist center like this one, where the power of prayer has invested that atmosphere within with soothing vibrations and protection. However, upon leaving this bastion of peace and serenity, he is set upon by two dark spirits who desire to make him suffer by way of basically a psychic assault on his spiritual well-being. Andre, ever the student of the spirit world, watches this young man suffering, remembers his own suffering in the spirit world, in the lower zone, before his rescue, and wonders what relief could rescue this incarnate young man from his tormentors. And his spirit teacher tells him, he advises, he says, "You have begun to observe the manifestations of vampirism, which are not limited to the environments of the incarnate. Almost all suffering in the lower zones owes its piteous origin to such vampirism." And if you have read Andre's sojourn in the lower zone, you know that he was tormented terribly by people, calling him suicide, which he objected to vehemently. So Andre then, he wonders, how is this man going to be helped? He's incarnate. So Alexandra tells him it will be instructive to follow the young man home, where he will see the most powerful antidote. And Andre follows him to his home and witnesses something that he finds rather puzzling. The vampiric entities stop at the door of the house, unable to enter. And Andre asks why, wordlessly mouths the why, and he's told, "Here lives a sister who has been fortunate enough to cultivate fervent and righteous prayer." And he further explains that a home is not only an abode for bodies. Above all, it is an abode for souls. The domestic sanctuary, inhabited by persons who love prayer and uplifting sentiments, becomes a sublime field for the most beautiful spiritual flowerings and harvests. And Andre watches as the young man goes to his bedroom to seek his rest, and he sees the man's wife, who is already disengaged from her body in sleep, she goes to her husband and lays his head on her spiritual lap and gives him healing energies through prayer. So here we learn that prayer, in addition to establishing vibratory borders to keep out ignorant spirits, also helps to heal spirits who have been victimized by spiritual oppression. So, what have we learned about the use and the effectiveness of prayer? We've seen that prayer is a powerful link in a chain of increasingly higher spiritual evolution that leads to God. We've seen that prayer increases the capacity of a spirit for receiving spiritual gifts. Also, that prayer transforms the home into a fortress against the darkness. And finally, that prayer is a very powerful antidote to psychic disturbances. Now, let us return to the news item that I referred to at the very beginning of our discussion. Given what the Andre Luiz series reveals about the power of prayer, let's see if we can reinterpret the seeming non-effects of the power of prayer that was offered by Pope Francis, Shimon Peres, and Mahmoud Abbas. You may recall that we discussed the prayer of Ismailia in the Messengers at some length, but let's take a closer look now at the prayer, at the effects of her prayer upon the sleeping patients in the spiritual outpost. And Aniceto explains, and he says, "You may have noticed that there are 1,980 sleeping patients, but only 400 are being given specialized nourishment. Of these 400, only 2/3 have shown themselves capable of receiving magnetic passes, and only 2 actually got up." And he says, "Don't forget this lesson. Let us all do good without anxiety. Let us sow always and everywhere, but let us not delay in a demand for results." And here I would pause and say, does that sound familiar? A demand for results. That sounds very familiar to me when I think about that story of the Pope and his 2 friends. Well, if we apply this lesson to the prayers for peace that was offered by the Pope and the 2 statesmen, could we not surmise then that these prayers may have had a similar effect? That is to say, it could be that the inner thoughts of the multitudes of people who were aware of this event may have been affected by these prayers, though not enough to have brought about a noticeable change in their outward behavior. It could have planted a seed, however, a seed of change that would develop slowly over time. And, we also want to remember how long Andre languished in the lower zone before the constant prayers of his mother finally had an effect and inspired him to pray for his rescue. So consider also the level of receptivity to prayers for peace on the part of the people involved in this terrible conflict between Hamas and Israel, in a land where it is highly likely that spiritual vampirism is taking place. As in the case of the receptivity to the prayer of Ismailia, the majority may not be able, in their present stage of spiritual evolution, to receive the help that prayers of peace might offer them. And we might also recognize that those who may be subject to vampirism in this land, this violent place, may not have a sanctuary such as was provided by the wife of that husband in Missionaries of the Light, who goes into the door and is safe from those who are oppressing him. So, at this point, I want to pause and ask for a show of hands, how many people have been to Rome, to the Vatican, to St. Peter's? Okay, a few of you. Good. So, I want to ask that because I want us to consider the fact that at St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, it's been a place of prayer for centuries. And when I was there, I felt this vibratory power in that place, where millions have prayed. You feel it when you walk in. So for me, that's more than a small indication of the power of prayer. For me, that was very powerful. And so I would conclude, rather than criticize, that maybe it's better for us to join together and pray for peace, for shalom, for salam. And let's give the best possible answer to those who scoff at the efficacy of prayer. Our own persistence, our own force, our own strength of will, bolstered by our knowledge that we are indeed what we think, and by our knowledge that our efforts at prayer truly do create a link with the higher spheres of the spiritual world. So I will end here, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.